The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the endless expanse of scrubland, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat that distorted the horizon. Jack Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow with a weathered hand, his pale blue eyes scanning the desolate landscape ahead. The cattle had been restless all morning, and his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Dolly, kept flicking her ears nervously at sounds only she could hear. Jack had been riding fence for the Double R Ranch for 3 years now, and in all that time he'd learned to trust two things: his horse's instincts and his own gut. Both were telling him something was wrong. The wind carried the acrid smell of gunpowder and something else, something metallic that made his stomach clench. Blood. Fresh blood. "Easy, girl," he murmured to Dolly, guiding her carefully around a cluster of mesquite bushes. The mare's hooves crunched softly on the dry earth, the only sound in the oppressive silence that had settled over the land like a heavy blanket. That's when he saw them. 3 bodies lay scattered across a small clearing, their blue cavalry uniforms dark with blood and dust. Soldiers. Jack's jaw tightened as he dismounted, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt 45 at his hip. He'd seen enough death in his 32 years to know when men had died hard, and these soldiers had fought to the bitter end. The tracks told the story. Unshod horses, at least a dozen of them, had surrounded the soldiers' position. An Apache war party. Jack felt his throat go dry. The Apache had been quiet for months, and folks had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the troubles were behind them. He was about to remount and ride hard for the ranch house when he heard it. A low, ragged sound that was barely human. A groan, filled with pain and desperation. Jack froze, every muscle in his body taut as a bowstring. The sound came again, weaker this time, from a stand of prickly pear cactus about 50 yards away. Against every instinct screaming at him to ride away, Jack found himself walking toward the sound, his boots silent on the sandy ground. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his days. An Apache warrior lay crumpled against the base of a large boulder, his bronze skin pale and slick with sweat. A cavalry saber protruded from his left shoulder, and a rifle bullet had torn through his thigh, leaving a trail of dark blood on the rock behind him. The man's breathing was shallow and labored, his dark eyes fluttering between consciousness and the void. Jack stared down at him, his mind racing. This was Taza, one of Chief Naiche's most feared warriors. Jack recognized the distinctive silver armband and the eagle feather woven into his long black hair. The man had probably killed dozens of settlers, maybe even some Jack had known. By all rights, Jack should put a bullet in his head and ride away. But as he looked into those dark, pain-filled eyes, Jack saw something that stopped him cold. Not the savage killer the newspapers wrote about, not the boogeyman mothers used to frighten children into bed. He saw a man, a human being clinging to life with the same desperate will that drove every living creature. "Damn," Jack whispered, holstering his gun. "Damn, damn, damn." The warrior's eyes focused on him with visible effort, and Jack could see the confusion there. Taza had expected to die alone, and now here was a white man standing over him, a man who should have been his enemy. "Can you understand me?" Jack asked quietly, kneeling beside the wounded Apache. Taza's lips moved, but no sound came out. His breathing was getting shallower, and Jack could see the life bleeding out of him with each passing second. Jack looked around frantically. The nearest doctor was in El Paso, 3 days' hard ride away. The Apache would be dead within hours, maybe minutes. But Jack had treated enough wounded cattle and horses to know something about stopping bleeding and cleaning wounds. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself, but his hands were already moving, tearing strips from his own shirt. "This is the craziest damn thing I've ever done." As Jack began to work on the Apache's wounds, cleaning them with water from his canteen and binding them with improvised bandages, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. Out here on the frontier, saving a life could indeed cost you your own. But as he looked into Taza's grateful, confused eyes, Jack realized he couldn't live with himself if he walked away. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that matched the blood on Jack's hands. He'd stopped the worst of the bleeding, but Taza needed shelter, rest, and proper care if he was going to live through the night. Jack's isolated line camp was only 2 miles away, a small cabin where he stayed during his week's riding fence. It was off the main trails, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods by a small creek. If he could get Taza there— "Can you ride?" Jack asked, knowing the question was probably pointless. Taza's eyes met his, and with tremendous effort, the Apache warrior nodded once. Jack helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight as they stumbled toward Dolly. Getting the wounded man onto the horse was a nightmare of muffled groans and careful maneuvering, but somehow they managed it. As they rode slowly toward the line camp, Jack couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into. In Texas, in 1878, helping an Apache warrior was more than just dangerous. It was treason. If anyone found out, Jack would be lucky to face a hanging. More likely, he'd simply disappear one night, his body left for the vultures. But as he felt Taza swaying weakly behind him, clinging to consciousness through sheer force of will, Jack knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. Out here, where the line between civilization and savagery grew thinner every day, sometimes a man had to decide what kind of person he really was. The sun was setting, painting the world in blood and gold, and Jack Morrison rode toward an uncertain future, with an enemy on his back and questions in his heart that had no easy answers. The line camp squatted in the grove of cottonwoods, like a weathered monument to solitude, its rough-hewn logs darkened by years of sun and storm. Jack had built it himself 3 summers ago, and it had served him well during the long weeks he spent riding the outer boundaries of the Double R's vast holdings. Now, as he helped the wounded Apache warrior inside, the small cabin felt like the most dangerous place on earth. Taza collapsed onto Jack's narrow cot the moment they crossed the threshold, his breathing ragged and his bronze skin frighteningly pale. Jack lit a kerosene lamp with shaking hands, the warm yellow light revealing just how close to death his unexpected patient really was. The makeshift bandages were soaked through with blood, and Taza's eyes had the glassy look of a man fighting fever. "What the hell am I doing?" Jack muttered to himself as he rummaged through his supplies for the bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies. This definitely qualified. He poured a generous amount over his hands and began unwrapping the blood-soaked bandages. Taza's eyes snapped open as Jack cleaned the wounds with whiskey, the Apache's jaw clenching against the pain. But he made no sound. Jack had to admire the man's stoicism. He'd seen plenty of cowboys scream like children over far lesser injuries. "That saber did a number on you," Jack said quietly, more to fill the silence than because he expected an answer. "Went clean through the muscle but missed the bone. You're lucky." Taza's dark eyes fixed on Jack's face, studying him with an intensity that was unnerving. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "Why?" The simple question hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. Jack's hands stilled on the bandage he was wrapping around the Apache's shoulder. It was a fair question, and one Jack wasn't sure he could answer. "Don't rightly know," Jack said finally, securing the bandage with a knot. "Maybe I'm just too stubborn to let a man die when I can help it. Your people, they would kill you for this." It wasn't a question, and Jack couldn't deny it. "Probably," he admitted. "Yours too, I'd guess." Something that might have been amusement flickered in Taza's eyes. "Yes, they would think you had bewitched me, made me weak." Jack finished tending to the leg wound and sat back on his heels, studying the Apache warrior. "You don't seem weak to me. Anybody else would have been dead hours ago." The 2 men regarded each other in the lamplight, the weight of their situation settling between them like a heavy stone. Outside, the Texas wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. The normal sounds of the frontier, but tonight they seemed ominous, as if the very land itself was watching and waiting. "There's beans and hardtack," Jack said, standing up and moving to the small wood stove in the corner. "Nothing fancy, but it'll keep body and soul together." As he prepared a simple meal, Jack found himself stealing glances at Taza. The Apache had closed his eyes, but Jack could tell he wasn't sleeping. His breathing was too controlled, too watchful. He was resting but ready, like a wild animal that knows it's surrounded by predators. The beans were heating when Jack heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching through the grove. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. Nobody came to the line camp except him, and he wasn't expecting any visitors. Taza's eyes snapped open, meeting Jack's across the small cabin. Without a word, the Apache rolled off the cot and crawled underneath it, his movements surprisingly quick despite his injuries. Jack blew out the lamp and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, their faces illuminated by the moonlight. Jack's heart sank as he recognized them. Pete Daniels, the ranch foreman, and 2 of the other hands, Billy Yates and Tom Crawford. They'd probably noticed his absence and come looking for him. "Jack!" Pete's voice boomed across the clearing. "You in there, boy? Saw your horse outside?" Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "Yeah, Pete. Just getting some supper started." He relit the lamp and opened the door, stepping out onto the small porch. The 3 men dismounted and approached, their faces grim in the lamplight. "We got trouble, Jack," Pete said without preamble. "Found 3 dead soldiers about 5 miles south of here. Looks like Apache work. The army's forming up a posse to track 'em down." Jack forced his face to remain neutral. "That so? Any idea which way they headed?" "Tracks lead north toward the Guadalupe Mountains," Billy said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "But that ain't what's got us worried. Tom here thinks he saw smoke from your camp earlier, and we wanted to make sure you weren't having Apache troubles of your own." Tom Crawford nodded, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. "Saw a signal fire earlier, or thought I did. Could have been nothing, but with them red devils on the warpath." "No trouble here," Jack said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Just me and the beans." Pete's eyes narrowed slightly. "You feeling all right, Jack? You look a mite peaked." "Just tired. Been riding fence since dawn." The foreman studied Jack's face for a long moment, and Jack could practically see the gears turning in the older man's head. Pete Daniels hadn't survived 20 years on the frontier by being careless or trusting. "Well," Pete said finally, "we'll be heading back to the ranch. The colonel wants every man ready to ride with the army come morning. This Apache business has got everyone spooked." Jack nodded. "I'll be there. See that you are." Pete mounted his horse, but before he could ride away, his eyes fell on something that made Jack's blood freeze. There, barely visible in the lamplight, was a dark stain on the porch boards. Blood. Pete's hand moved to his gun, and the tension in the clearing became thick enough to cut with a knife. "Jack," he said slowly, "where'd that blood come from?" Jack's mind raced, searching for an explanation that wouldn't get him killed. "Cut myself earlier," he said, holding up his left hand to show a small nick on his palm, a real cut he'd gotten while handling barbed wire 2 days ago. Clumsy with the knife. Pete stared at the cut, then at the blood on the porch. The amount didn't match, and they both knew it. For a long, terrible moment, Jack thought his life was about to end in a hail of gunfire. Then Tom Crawford's horse snorted and shied, drawing everyone's attention. "Easy, boy," Tom said, fighting to control the animal. "Something's got him spooked." "Probably just a snake," Pete said, but his eyes never left Jack's face. "We'll see you in the morning, Jack. Don't be late." The 3 men rode away, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. Jack stood on the porch until he could no longer hear their hoofbeats, then went back inside, his hands shaking as he relit the lamp. Taza crawled out from under the cot, his face grim. "They suspect." "Yeah," Jack admitted. "Pete's no fool. He knows something's not right." The Apache warrior struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the wall. "I should go, before they return with others." "You can barely stand," Jack protested. "You wouldn't make it a mile." Better that than to bring death to you." Jack looked at the Apache warrior, this man who should have been his enemy, who was now risking his own life out of concern for Jack's safety. It was a gesture that spoke louder than any words about the man's character. "Nobody's going anywhere tonight," Jack said firmly. "We'll figure something out in the morning." As they settled in for what might be their last night alive, both men understood that dawn would bring choices that could not be undone. The frontier was a place where mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and weakness could get you killed. But sometimes, Jack thought as he watched Taza's chest rise and fall in the lamplight, a man had to decide whether surviving was worth the cost of losing his soul. Outside, the wind continued to whisper through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise of a reckoning that neither man could escape. Dawn came to the Texas frontier like a reluctant witness, painting the sky in shades of gray and amber, while the morning mist rose from the creek behind Jack's cabin. Inside, both men had barely slept, each lost in their own thoughts about what the day would bring. Taza sat propped against the wall, his color better than it had been the night before. The fever had broken sometime during the small hours, and though he was still weak, Jack could see the strength returning to his dark eyes. The Apache warrior had been watching the window since first light, his hand never far from the knife at his belt. "Your foreman will return," Taza said quietly, "with soldiers." Jack nodded, pouring coffee from the pot he'd kept warm on the stove. "Probably. Pete's suspicious by nature, and that blood on the porch?" He shook his head. "I should have been more careful." "You saved my life. A man cannot be careful when he acts from the heart." Jack looked up, surprised by the Apache's words. In the harsh light of dawn, with death potentially riding toward them, such sentiment seemed almost foolish. Yet there was truth in it that Jack couldn't deny. "Your shoulder," Jack said, changing the subject. "How's it feel?" Taza moved his arm experimentally, wincing slightly. "It will serve. The wound is clean." He paused, studying Jack's face. "You have skill with healing. Where did you learn?" "Army surgeon in the war," Jack said, settling down across from the Apache with his coffee. "Picked up a few things watching him work." He took a sip of the bitter brew. "What about you? You speak English better than most folks I know." "Mission school," Taza replied. "The black robes taught me their language, their writing. They said it would help my people understand the white man's world." His expression darkened. "They were wrong. Understanding did not bring peace." Jack could hear the pain in the Apache's voice, the weight of broken promises and shattered hopes. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Why?" Taza's eyes fixed on Jack's face. "You did not make the promises. You did not break them." "No, but I'm part of the world that did." They sat in silence for a moment, two men from different worlds bound together by circumstance and an unlikely mutual respect. Outside, the morning was growing brighter, and Jack knew that time was running short. "There's something I need to know," Jack said finally. "Those soldiers yesterday, did you kill them?" Taza finished. "No. I was trying to stop the killing when their officer put his saber through my shoulder." He touched the bandaged wound gingerly. "My cousin, Nalnish, he leads the young men now. They are angry, full of hate. They do not listen to voices of reason." Jack felt a mixture of relief and confusion. "So you were trying to prevent the attack?" "The soldiers were escorting a supply wagon to Fort Davis. Food, medicine, blankets, things my people need for the coming winter." Taza's jaw tightened. Nalnish saw only blue coats and old enemies. He could not see that some wars are not worth fighting. The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air, distant but unmistakable. Jack moved to the window and peered out through the curtains. A dust cloud was rising from the direction of the main ranch, and he could make out the shapes of at least a dozen riders. "They're coming," Jack said, his heart beginning to race. Taza struggled to his feet, his hand moving to his knife. "I will not run. If this is where I die, so be it." Jack stared at the Apache warrior, seeing something in his face that he recognized, the same stubborn pride that had driven Jack to help him in the first place. "Maybe it doesn't have to be," he said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. What do you mean? Jack moved to his trunk and pulled out a spare shirt and pants, along with an old hat he rarely wore. How's your English when you need to sound like a cowhand? Taza's eyes widened as he understood what Jack was suggesting. You want me to pretend to be one of your people? Your skin's not that much darker than mine after a summer in the sun, Jack said, tossing the clothes to the Apache. And with that bullet wound, you could pass for a cowboy who got shot up in a scrape with rustlers. It will never work, Taza protested, but he was already reaching for the shirt. Maybe not, Jack admitted, but it's better than dying. As Taza changed into the Western clothes, Jack quickly hid any evidence of the Apache's presence, the blooded bandages, Taza's traditional clothing, anything that might give them away. The warrior's long hair was a problem, but Jack solved it by braiding it tightly and tucking it up under the hat. Remember, Jack said as the sound of hoofbeats grew closer, you're Tom Rodriguez, a vaquero from down south. You got shot by cattle rustlers 2 days ago, and I found you on the trail. Taza nodded, his face grim with concentration. Tom Rodriguez, he repeated, the accent he affected remarkably convincing. The riders burst into the clearing with Pete Daniels in the lead, followed by a cavalry officer Jack didn't recognize, and what looked like half the ranch hands from the Double R. Jack stepped out onto the porch, fighting to keep his expression neutral. Mornin', Pete, he called out. You boys are up early. Pete's eyes immediately went to the dark stain on the porch, then swept the clearing for any sign of trouble. Jack, this is Lieutenant Morrison from Fort Davis. He's tracking the Apache war party that killed those soldiers. The lieutenant, a young man with serious eyes and a precisely waxed mustache, dismounted and approached the cabin. Mr. Morrison, he said formally, we need to search your premises. We have reason to believe the Apache may have passed through this area. Jack's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. Of course, Lieutenant. Though I should warn you, I've got a wounded man inside. Found him shot up by rustlers a couple days back. The lieutenant's eyebrows rose. A wounded man? Why wasn't this reported? Figured I'd get him patched up first, then decide what to do, Jack said, opening the cabin door. Come on in, but go easy. He's in a bad way. Jack led the lieutenant inside, followed by Pete and 2 of the soldiers. Taza lay on the cot, his face pale and drawn, with what looked like pain, but Jack knew was concentration. The hat pulled low over his face cast shadows that helped hide his features. This is Tom Rodriguez, Jack said. Vaquero from down near the border. Rustlers put 2 bullets in him and left him for dead. Lieutenant Morrison approached the cot, his hand resting on his sword hilt. Rodriguez, can you hear me? Taza's eyes fluttered open, and when he spoke, his voice was weak, but the accent was perfect. Si, senor, I hear you. You were shot by rustlers. 3 men, Taza replied, his English slightly broken in the way of a man for whom it was a second language. They took the cattle, tried to kill me. This man, he saved my life. The lieutenant studied Taza's face carefully, and Jack held his breath. In the dim light of the cabin, with the hat shadowing his features and the authentic pain in his eyes, the Apache warrior looked like exactly what they claimed he was, a wounded cowboy lucky to be alive. Have you seen any Apache in the area? The lieutenant asked. Taza shook his head weakly. No, senor, only the rustlers. Pete stepped forward, his eyes suspicious. That's a lot of blood on the porch for a man who was shot somewhere else. Jack's mind raced. Had to dig one of the bullets out, he said. Made a mess of it, I'm afraid. Tom here bled like a stuck pig. The foreman's eyes narrowed, but before he could ask another question, one of the soldiers called out from outside, Lieutenant, we found tracks. Morrison hurried outside, followed by Pete and the others. Jack and Taza were left alone for a moment, and the Apache warrior's eyes met Jack's with something that might have been gratitude. Unshod ponies heading north, the soldier reported when they rejoined the group. Looks like they passed through here yesterday, maybe early this morning. Lieutenant Morrison studied the tracks, then looked back at the cabin. Mr. Morrison, we'll be moving on, but I'll need you to report to Fort Davis as soon as your friend is able to travel. We'll need a full statement about these rustlers." "Of course," Jack said, fighting to keep the relief out of his voice. As the soldiers and ranch hands mounted up to continue their pursuit, Pete lingered behind. "Jack," he said quietly, "I don't know what you're up to, but be careful. There's something about this whole situation that doesn't sit right with me." "I appreciate the concern, Pete, but everything's fine." Pete studied Jack's face for a long moment, then shook his head. "I sure hope you know what you're doing, boy, because if you don't, it's going to get you killed." As the posse rode away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the morning air, Jack felt his knees go weak with relief. They'd done it, somehow, impossibly. They'd fooled an entire cavalry unit and lived to tell about it. Inside the cabin, Taza was sitting up on the cot, the cowboy hat still pulled low over his face. "Tom Rodriguez," he said, and there was something that might have been amusement in his voice. "First name that came to mind," Jack said, collapsing into a chair. "I can't believe that worked." "It worked because you risked everything to make it work," Taza said quietly. "No man has ever done such a thing for me." Jack looked at the Apache warrior, no longer his enemy, no longer a stranger, but something else entirely, something that didn't have a name in either of their worlds. "What happens now?" Jack asked. Taza was quiet for a long moment. "Now I must decide what kind of man I wish to be," he said finally, "as you have shown me what kind of man you are." Outside, the Texas sun climbed higher into the endless sky, and two men sat in a small cabin, bound together by an act of mercy that had changed them both forever. The frontier was still a hard place, still unforgiving and brutal, but for this moment, in this place, humanity had triumphed over hatred. It was enough. It had to be. 3 days later, Jack Morrison sat in the shade of the cottonwoods behind his cabin, watching Tom Rodriguez. The name had stuck, almost as if Taza had shed his old identity like a snake shedding skin, practice walking without the limp that betrayed his injuries. The Apache warrior's recovery had been remarkable, a testament to both his natural resilience and Jack's rudimentary medical skills. The man who emerged from that small cabin was neither the feared Apache warrior Taza nor the fictional vaquero Tom Rodriguez, but something new, something that belonged fully to neither world, but drew strength from both. "The soldiers will expect to see me at Fort Davis soon," Taza said, settling down beside Jack in the dappled shade. "Tom Rodriguez must give his statement about the rustlers." Jack nodded, though the thought of walking into a military fort with an Apache warrior disguised as a Mexican cowboy still seemed like the most dangerous gamble of his life. "You sure you want to go through with this? Once you're on the Army's books as Tom Rodriguez, there's no going back." "There was no going back the moment you pulled that saber from my shoulder," Taza replied. "My cousin Nalnish and his warriors, they will think I am dead. My old life is finished. And what kind of life do you want now?" Taza was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the vast expanse of Texas scrubland that stretched to the horizon. "I want to live in a way that honors what you have shown me," he said finally, "that there can be something more than hatred between our peoples." That afternoon, they rode together toward Fort Davis, Jack on Dolly and Taza on a gentle sorrel mare that Jack had bought from a neighboring ranch, with the story that his wounded friend needed a calm horse for his recovery. The ride took most of the day, and they spoke little, both men lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. Fort Davis squatted on the desert floor like a collection of children's blocks, its adobe walls baking in the relentless sun. As they approached the main gate, Jack felt his mouth go dry with nervousness. If anyone recognized Taza for what he really was. "Easy, amigo," Taza said quietly, the Spanish accent he'd adopted coming naturally now. "We are just two cowboys with a story to tell." Lieutenant Morrison was waiting for them in his office, a small, stuffy room lined with maps and military dispatches. He looked up as they entered, his eyes immediately going to Taza's face. For a heart-stopping moment, Jack thought he saw recognition there, but then the lieutenant was standing and extending his hand. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm glad to see you're feeling better. Please, both of you, have a seat." The questioning that followed was thorough but routine. Taza told his story with the easy confidence of a man who had lived it. How he'd been driving cattle for a rancher near the border, how the three rustlers had ambushed him, how Jack had found him and saved his life. His English was exactly what it should be, fluent but accented, the words of a man educated by necessity rather than privilege. "These rustlers," Lieutenant Morrison said, making notes on a piece of paper. "Can you describe them?" Ataza provided descriptions that were detailed enough to be convincing, but vague enough to be useless. 3 Anglo men, average height and build, riding horses with no distinguishing marks. Men who could have been anyone or no one. "We'll keep an eye out for them," the lieutenant said, though his tone suggested he didn't expect to find them. Rustlers were as common as tumbleweeds in this part of Texas, and most were never caught. As they prepared to leave, Lieutenant Morrison stood and extended his hand again. "Mr. Rodriguez, if you're planning to stay in the area, we could use good men. The Army's always looking for experienced scouts and guides." Jack's heart nearly stopped, but Taza just smiled and shook the officer's hand. "Gracias, senor, but I think I will try my hand at ranching for a while. This man, Jack, he has offered me work on his ranch." It wasn't true. Jack had made no such offer. But as they walked out of the fort into the blazing afternoon sun, Jack realized it could be. The double R was big enough that one more hand wouldn't be noticed, especially one with the kind of skills Taza possessed. "Think you'd like to be a cowboy?" Jack asked, as they mounted their horses. "I think," Taza said, settling into the saddle with the easy grace of a man born to ride, "that I would like to find out what Tom Rodriguez can become." They rode back toward the ranch as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jack found himself thinking about the future in a way he hadn't in years. Not just his own future, but the future of this strange friendship that had grown between them. 6 months later, Tom Rodriguez was known throughout the area as one of the best horsemen and trackers the Double R had ever employed. He was quiet, reliable, and had an almost supernatural ability to find lost cattle and read the land in ways that amazed even the most experienced hands. If some of the other cowboys occasionally wondered about his past, his scars, or the way his eyes sometimes grew distant when he looked toward the mountains, they kept their questions to themselves. Jack and Tom worked together often, riding the far boundaries of the ranch where the dangers were greatest and the work hardest. They had developed an easy partnership, built on mutual respect and the shared knowledge of what they had survived together. They rarely spoke of that first night in the cabin, or of the man Taza had been before he became Tom Rodriguez, but the bond between them was unbreakable. It was on a cold morning in late autumn that their past finally caught up with them. Jack was mending fence near the line camp when he saw the riders approaching, a dozen Apache warriors moving across the scrubland with the fluid grace of men who belonged to the land itself. At their head rode a young man Jack recognized from Pete's descriptions as Nalnish, Taza's cousin and the leader of the war party that had killed the soldiers. Jack's hand moved to his rifle, but Tom's voice stopped him. "No," Tom said quietly. He was standing beside his horse about 50 yards away, and even at that distance, Jack could see the tension in his body. "They come for me." Nalnish rode forward until he was close enough to speak without shouting. When he called out, it was in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. Jack couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the anger and accusation in them. Tom replied in the same language, his voice calm but firm. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other warriors occasionally adding their voices to the discussion. Jack watched helplessly, his hand still on his rifle, knowing that any move he made could trigger a fight that would get them all killed. Finally, Nalnish fell silent. He stared at Tom for a long moment, then spat something that sounded like a curse and wheeled his horse around. The war party rode away as quickly as they had come, leaving only dust and tension behind. Tom walked over to where Jack was standing, his face grave. "He says I am dead to them," he said quietly, "that the man who was Taza died in the desert, and this creature wearing his face is something unnatural." "I'm sorry," Jack said, meaning it. Tom shook his head. "Do not be. He is right in a way. Taza is dead. But Tom Rodriguez—" He smiled, and for the first time since Jack had known him, it was completely without sadness. "Tom Rodriguez is very much alive." As they rode back toward the ranch house, Jack thought about the price they had both paid for their friendship. Tom had lost his family, his people, his very identity. Jack had risked his reputation, his job, possibly his life. And yet, looking at the man riding beside him, this Apache warrior who had become a Texas cowboy, this enemy who had become a brother, Jack knew he would make the same choice again. The frontier was still a hard place, still unforgiving and often brutal. But it was also a place where a man could choose who he wanted to be, where the past didn't have to define the future, and where sometimes, just sometimes, mercy could triumph over hatred. On that autumn day, riding through the endless Texas scrubland with his unlikely friend beside him, Jack Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not for himself alone, but for the possibility that the world might someday become a place where the color of a man's skin mattered less than the content of his character. It was a good feeling to ride with.